That's why I said it was a spicy scripture today. Kind of spicy. But we got to jump back into the context of the passage, or else we're going to use it in ways that are not necessarily applicable to the time it was written. So just a couple of reminders before we get going for some context. James is written before the creeds. All the creeds on what it meant, all the things you had to know inside of your brain to be considered a Christian. The creeds were not written for a couple more 100 years. They were working on them here and there, but there was all these different branches of Christianity. And the thing that kind of held them together was we're trying to live out the way that Christ showed us how to live. And then kind of after Rome took over the Christian church in 380-ish, somewhere in there, it was not so much about trying to live the manner of Christ, but then trying to know the things we're supposed to know to be a Christian. So it was a big shift that happened there. James is written far before any of those. It's one of the earliest books of our Bible that was written. Mark was written in the 40s. James was probably written right around there. We got some letters of Paul, like Thessalonians and stuff. Some of the later books, like Revelation and John, they're going to come like 45 years later after this one's written. So they don't have the Bible, they don't have the creeds, they don't have a lot to guide them. What they have is, well, Jesus said to live this way, so we're going to try and live this way. That wasn't all about what we knew and we're trying to put inside of our brains. So that's something that we got to keep in mind when reading this book, because it's pretty much commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is like, live this way. And so James is giving commentary on that. It was written with this question, what is faith supposed to do? Not what do we need to know in order to proclaim faith or confess faith, but if we have it, what are we supposed to do? What's it supposed to look like in our lives if we have something called faith? Because for James, faith was a verb. It was something that was an action. It was like something that was happening. Right? It's not a possession that you have, where you pray this prayer, or you agree with this doctrine, or you adhere to this denomination or whatever, and then you have something like this noun called faith. Faith was a verb, something that you did, something that produced action. And so James is trying to spell out what that looks like in his context, and it's written to Jewish Christians. So James is kind of the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and he's writing to Jewish Christians that are kind of scattered abroad, looking all over the place. And so he's sending letters out to all these small groups of Christians meeting in people's homes that were Jewish, but then they believed that Christ was the Messiah, and was saying, we're Jewish, and we're trying to follow what Jesus told us to do. So that's who it was written to, and it was not written to individuals, like, here's a letter for you, Mr. New Christian person. It was written to a community of people. So it was written to communities, and this is what faith should look like for all of you. So it wasn't necessarily, you and you and you and you. It was like, this is what communal faith looks like. So if faith is vibrant and alive in a small community within a large, context of Roman government, this is what it looks like to be in that community. And so he's writing to all of you, all of you, all of you. So remember, when you're reading scripture, when you get into the word you should remember this, or you should do this. It's always plural. The you is always plural. So my friend from Alabama, he's like, the yous should actually be y'alls. He's like, y'all should be doing the y'all. So it's a community-oriented thing. Didn't really go through the individual revolution. That was much later through the Renaissance and Romantic era. That's got to be like 1,000 some years later. So they were very communal oriented. So those are just some things to remember. The problems when we read this and we take it as an individualistic creedal document, things we're supposed to know, then it turns into, sounds really harsh and spicy. So if we take it out of that realm and put it back into these contexts, it gets a little less spicy. So that's just the reminder. That's a little context for you. Now, a story. My very first job, official job, besides being a paper boy, because that wasn't really, that was a job, but I was like 8 or something. I was a cook at a restaurant, and I kind of worked my way from dishwasher to cook. And I got tired of being inside all the time. And there was no windows in the kitchen, so there would be days I would get there before the sun came up, and I would stay until the sun went down, and I would go outside and say, I never saw the sun today. It was a good job. I learned a lot of skills. It was stressful and all that kind of stuff. It was good. But my second job was totally different. It was outside. And at first I was like, this is glorious. I love this. I'm outside. And I was working in construction lots, and I was pretty much like the trash man. I would take construction debris and haul it to the dump. So they would bring everything out, and it was a two-man operation. And there was a dump truck, and then there was like this little, it was like a lifter thing, but it had like claws on it. Have you ever seen those things? It's like go in and they like munched it, and then it dropped it into the dump truck. And my job was to jump inside of the dump truck and make everything flat so we can fill it up more and more and more, so we'd do less trips to the dump. That was my job. My first day on the job, we kind of go and he shows me the ropes, and where he's doing the thing and I'm doing stuff, and he's like, all right, now just jump into the truck and we're gonna go around the corner. And I was like, wait a second, what? He's like, yeah, the truck. Jump into the truck. You're gonna drive that thing. Now mind you, I drive an 86 Chevette. Like the little tiny thing, it's like, it was so tiny, I was contemplating taking out the front seat so I could sit in the back seat and drive like a normal person, because I was, 6'5" at the time. And so he's like, yeah, just hop in the dump truck and I'm gonna tow this guy on, we're got another site to go to. I was not prepared for this moment. Not at all. I don't know if you've ever went from a little Chevette to jumping into a large dump truck like this. I was a little bit like, this is a really large vehicle. And I like to climb in this thing. I'm getting up steps and I get in and I sit down and I'm like, wow, the ground is so far down. And the steering wheel's like this, and I'm like, this is a lot bigger than my Chevette. So fortunately, it was not manual, because I don't know how to drive one of those. And I put it into drive, and I start driving down this suburban neighborhood. They're adding onto it. And it comes to a T, so I gotta make a turn, and I'm getting nervous because there's cars parked on both sides of the T here, and then when I turn, there's cars parked on both sides of the T here. I'm thinking to myself, how am I gonna get this behemoth of a vehicle? I mean, I know how to do that with my Chevette. You just zip it around. You gotta wind it up real good first, but then you zip it around. But I'm like, how am I gonna get this big, massive dump truck around these guys here and then in there? It was, I tell you, I may have had a small panic attack. And I pull out a little bit extra and I turn and I'm like going inch at a time. And then I jump out and I look and I'm like, okay, I got 6 more inches. I jump back in. And jumping out of a dump truck, even when you're 6'5", it's a little bit harder than you think, because you gotta climb back in and then you climb back out. And I'm trying to work my way through 4 cars with this big behemoth. And the guy who hired me, it was his business. He's just parked up there and just looking in his rearview mirror. I think he was laughing. I don't know. I think he was laughing at me. Maybe. But he was enjoying himself. And so I actually pulled through. Didn't scrape a vehicle, didn't touch a vehicle. I had 1 inch on both sides at the closest part. But I squeezed right through there, and then I drove right to the next place. And he got there, and he was laughing at me when I got out of the truck because I was sweating, because I had to drive in traffic with this thing too. And he was like, so how you doing? That was a tight fit, eh? And I was like, yeah, that was. You want to drive it next? I'll just drive your truck. So we swapped it there, and I had to work my way up. But that was my initiation into driving a big dump truck. And I lasted in that job about 6 months, and I was done. Because then winter came, and being outside in the winter was not as fun. I have to tell you that. So that was my thing, but I was amazed at how big this vehicle is, and this little steering wheel is like, I had to turn this whole big thing with this little steering wheel. I mean, it was bigger than my Chevette steering wheel, but I'm just amazed. That's what, when we get into this passage here, it's going to be talking about, the tongue, the words that we use, and how this little tiny thing that's a part of our body can shape our entire world. And so it's like this huge thing here. It's you can just turn the steering wheel and I'm moving a monster dump truck all around this neighborhood. And it's really interesting. But the passage starts off really like shocking. It's like, hey, you should not seek to become an influencer. That's like one of those hip words today. Don't seek to become a teacher. Don't seek it out. What is my job? Like, what do I do with this passage? Like, or if you're a school teacher at school, or you're a retired teacher, and you read this passage, what are you supposed to do with that? It's like, yeah, many of you should probably not become teachers, because there's a stricter judgment for you. It's like, whoa, that's spicy. I better back up here. What are we talking about here? What is actually going on in this passage? Not many people should seek to become teachers. And that's what I sought to do with my life, was become a teacher. Some of you have done that with your life, to be a teacher. Some of you enjoy teaching. So what is it actually talking about here? So if somebody comes into, we already talked about the favoritism from last week, about there's folks that when they walk in and they're like rich and they have authority and power, you know, they're Epicurean politicians, and they walk in the church, they expect to be treated like the rest of society does. And the church was like, all right, you're welcome here. Have a seat here. You're going to be serving that slave over their communion today. And it was a shock to the system. It was a shock to the whole culture. Because, well, what do you mean? I'm serving communion to a slave. Like, they're supposed to serve me. That's their role in society. That whole class system didn't exist. So when these people with authority would come into a church, they would expect that I get to have some authority here. And he says, don't seek to become a teacher in these small communities. Now, these are Jewish communities. They're Jewish Christians. They're meeting, and when they say in your church or in your community, the actual word there is synagogue. They're in your synagogue. They're still meeting in synagogues at this point. The Christians are meeting in synagogues. And in a synagogue, there's a seat of authority that teachers sit in. We've talked about it a little bit before, but here's a picture of one. There's the seat of Moses. It looks like, you know, if you go and you take, you know, a toddler to the restaurant and they can't quite reach the table, it looks like one of those. Like, I need one of those seats. It kind of looks like that. But remember, like, there's not a lot of wood in this society. It's mostly stone and things. There's a little bit of wood here and there, but most stuff is going to be carved out of stone. And who got to sit here but the teacher? Everyone else, where do they sit? There are no other seats. You stand up for the whole church. See, we're doing it backwards according to their culture. Doesn't mean we're doing it wrong, but I'm standing and you're seated. And that's kind of a thing. Like, when I'm doing a funeral and I'm sitting down and everyone's kind of talking, and then when I stand up, everyone's like, okay, we gotta be quiet now. This is when he's gonna do the thing. He's gonna be quiet now, right? It was the opposite in their culture. As soon as somebody took a seat at the front in the Moses, they're like, oh, we gotta be quiet. Teacher's about to say something, and everyone else is standing up. So that's how these societies work. You say, not many of you should seek authority because there's a great responsibility and scrutiny that comes with it. So does that mean that if you sought to become a teacher that you've actually done the wrong thing? He's not talking about that. He's talking about people who expect, because of their roles in society outside of the church, that they come in and they can just go right up here and sit down and start teaching. Because if you have like positions of authority in this culture, that comes with a lot of kickbacks, right? You can like, oh yeah, everyone respects me and it's great and it's easy and they give me bribes and they give me money and they give me gifts and they give me praise and they give me adoration. And so they sought to become teachers not because they wanted to impart information, but because they wanted all of the benefits that came with positions of authority. They wanted like all of the glory that came with it, and it didn't really matter what they said. It was the position that they could hold. And they're like, everyone wanted to become like, I want to go sit in that seat because that means that I can say anything I want and everyone has to listen. And like there was this whole like movement. I want to get authority not because I'm gifted to teach or because I want to teach or because I want to help people with better information. No, I want it because it gives me a lot of kickbacks and a lot of things, and people who can then get up with authority and then say things, they can really shape a whole culture with what they're saying. So he's talking about people who seeking positions of authority. It's like Spider-Man, like with great responsibility comes, how do you finish that?
Great power.
Great power comes great responsibility. Thank you. I'm glad we have young people here. All of these pop culture references. With great power comes great responsibility, right? So he's reminding these people of that. And the church is new, it's forming, they're not sure what's happening in it. And he's like, if people are coming in and they're wanting to come and take authority in positions of teaching and power, he's like, don't just let them just come in and do it just because they have fancier clothes on, or because they hold a position in society in your local town or something. Don't just hand those things out to people. Like, if they're not willing to serve and wanting to serve, you really got to put the brakes on and say, wait a second, hold up. And then he goes into his reasoning. It almost sounds like a different sermon. He's like, okay, don't become teachers. It's greater responsibility that it's going to, and scrutiny that it's going to invite. Well, let me talk about something else. I have a new topic. Let's talk about how we use our speech. But he's talking about teachers here. And I don't know about you, but growing up, I heard sermons about this passage where they cut off the front part of it and they just use the back part of it. And they're like, you got to use your words wisely. Don't gossip and don't cuss and don't do this and don't insult and don't do that. It's like, but that's disconnected from the opening phrase of don't become a teacher because your words matter. If you become a teacher just because you want all the kickbacks of it, which is not very much in our society, if you want all those kickbacks, then it's like, your words, when you are a position of authority, they matter and they shape a whole culture and society, and you can't just hand them out to folks. He's like, I did not have to drive a dump truck like this. This is the world's largest dump truck. So I looked up world's largest dump truck. That's the picture that came up. You see that tiny little hobbit there? No, that's a full-grown human. That's a full-grown human next to this thing. That is still turned with a little steering wheel. You can turn that big thing with a steering wheel. You can turn an aircraft carrier with it's a little bit bigger, but you can turn things with steering wheels. And James is trying to show us the words that are coming from the places of authority shape a whole people, and they're important. And when you have a position of authority, whether it's a kindergarten teacher, a pastor, or local politician, or wherever you hold those positions, your words matter. Your words give shape to the people hearing them, and you have to think them through, because there's a greater scrutiny that comes. And it's like your words can... Have you ever run into someone that are all talk? You heard that phrase? They're all talk. They are all talk. They just come in and they have all the talk and nothing to show for it. I actually did that. I did that when I was switching positions at a restaurant from one cook to the other. I walked in and it was like I was the head cook at that place. And I could run this whole line so smooth. I was like, and then the cook who was supposed to called in sick. And everyone then looked at me and he's like, well, he could do it. He said he could do it. And I was like, oh crap. I don't even know where the chicken is. So there I was. I had the whole lunch line all by my lonesome. And lunch rush hits. And now I'm behind. And then all the prep cooks are coming over and be like, we better help this guy. Because he was all talk. He was inflating all of his abilities and stuff. And now he's behind and struggling. I was out there for 2 weeks. But yeah, I was said all this great things about what I could do at my last position. I can do it here. And then I was all talk. And I showed up and I was like, I can't do this. I don't even know where this stuff is. And then all these people swooped in and helped me get to lunch rush. And I was embarrassed. It was like I had this amazing resume that I was like, look at all the stuff I can do. And I had these grand speeches of how I could do all these things, and it was great. And I was all talk. It was all talk, and I was humbled and embarrassed and humiliated by how behind I got and how much help I needed. When I could have just asked for it on the front end, and they would have gladly done it. And I like what this old saint, John of Climacus, that's a cool name. He said, let no one flatter himself that they can be the masters of their tongue unless they first become the masters of silence. Dang, that's good stuff. You ever have one of those people that they don't talk much, but when they do, everyone listens? Okay, we need to listen to this person, because when they say something that matters, that's what he's talking about here. Now, I've retranslated that passage for verses 1 through 5, and let me read that for you. Don't be so hasty to seek authority because of its great responsibility and the scrutiny it invites. Not a single soul is perfect, no matter what they say about themselves. If we had perfect control over what we said, you would see it in all our actions, because words are like a steering wheel, a small part of the vehicle that sets direction. No need to brag about your accomplishments. We will eventually see them in the repeated patterns of your actions. Dang. Okay, that makes a little more sense. As I'm like diving into the Greek and diving into how is it translated in other places, and then looking like what's a modern like way to say these things today, this is what I came up with. We will eventually see your abilities by the repeated patterns of your actions. You don't gotta go out and start tooting your own horn and all that kind of stuff. Don't have to do that. So that's the first part. And then he goes into the second part. It only takes a little spark to start a big fire. It's all this insignificant little spark can set a whole forest on fire. And then he goes into, and your tongue is like that. It's set on fire by the flames of hell themselves. It's like, well, those are fighting words, Like, I'm ready to go to bat. What are you talking about? What do you mean my tongue is set on fire by the blazes of hell? That's like, dang, there's some fundamentalists that just said amen to that. But what does it actually mean? Because we know in this part, before creeds, they didn't have a eschatology of heaven and hell as eternal destinations for after you die. They knew that there was a place that you go when you die, but they didn't have it all figured out in their heads. That came a couple hundred years later. So any interpretation we have of that word has to go dive back into what they meant when they said it. Because we have thousands of years of theology that we kind of added from that moment. So we gotta go back and what is he talking about? A little spark starts a fire. Now we know this, we've seen there's a picture of a forest fire. We've seen forest fires. Have you ever been burning cardboard in your backyard and a thing goes up and you're like, oh gosh. I hate burning cardboard now because, with Amazon, you get lots of cardboard in your house and I don't have recycling near me. I would have to drive miles and miles to get it. So we burn our cardboard in the backyard instead of throw it away. And, when you burn cardboard, they get those light papery gray things that are they look like that. And then they start floating in the sky and you're like, please go out, please go out, please go out. And I'm surrounded by farm fields, so I never want to burn cardboard when the corn is all dry. I'm like, I'm going to set the whole cornfield on fire with one small piece of, just one little small piece of cardboard is going to set the whole cornfield on fire. And then I'm going to have to pay for that. And that ain't going to happen very easily, right? That's a whole field of corn. It's 5-10 acres. So I'm always nervous because that little spark can go. And there's not a lot of forests in this area. There's a few here and there. But the area did have a lot of dry brush. And there was rainy seasons and lots of dry seasons. When it's really dry, have you ever got a little bit around the bonfire, a little spark? And it's starting to eat that dry grass around it. And you're like, get the hose, pat it out. A spark can do that. They knew that sparks could do this. That they can set on fire. And words are like that. The words of the people who hold authority that shape a whole community and people, it can either be helpful or it can start a fire. And you know how that works. You've seen that happen multiple times. This is just the nature of humanity. The things that people say can start forest fires, and they can get people all agitated, or they can soothe and calm and direct and help. And you know the difference when you encounter it. You know the difference when you encounter it. And he's saying, hey, nobody's perfect. Nobody's tamed their tongue. And he says, this is different because we've tamed every beast. And he goes through and lists them all, lizards and, and fish and birds. And we've tamed them all. And I was like, really? All the beasts? Have we tamed all the beasts? Every single one? We've tamed them all? Really? You're going to put a saddle on a trout and just start going down to tame them all? Well, he's talking about how animals have a natural hesitancy. When a lion's not hungry, he doesn't just go on a killing rampage, right? When he's not hungry, there's no reason to be afraid of a lion, right? They know how to restrain themselves. The animal kingdom, for the most part, knows how to restrain themselves, except for one animal. That's Scrooge McDuck. That selfish little, never mind. So, go back to this one. This one's better. This is funny. Every beast kind of has this natural restraint to them, where they're not gathering more and killing more and getting more than they need to. So he's trying to help us see, in the natural world, this is how it is. But then with humans, we have something different going on inside of our brains that cause us to want more and get more and seek more and more and more and more. And he uses a term called the tongue is set on fire by the flames of hell itself. And again, this is not a phrase that is talking about an eternal destination or the place where, a devil and demons reside and all that kind of stuff. That theology didn't come until much later. So what is James talking about? Let's back it up and say the word for hell there is the word Gehenna. And the word Gehenna is a physical location. It's right outside the place of Jerusalem. There was a valley of Hinnom, which then, that's the Hebrew word for Gehenna, which was the Greek word, which is then translated into hell in the English language. But the valley of Hinnom is where a lot of wars were fought, and it became like this notorious place because of a thing that happened in the Old Testament, where the people of God were worshiping this god called Molech, and they sacrificed their children to Molech. Killed their own children as a sacrifice to Molech. And it was like one of the lowest points of the Hebrew Bible is when they did this act, where they worshiped the god of Molech, who demanded a sacrifice of their child. And the story of Abraham and Isaac, if you've ever thought that was weird, is kind of like the counter thing to this. So yes, on its face, that is a weird story. He's like, oh, you should go sacrifice your son on this mountain. So he goes up there and he's going to do it. And he's like, nope, actually, I've never asked that of anyone. It's kind of a counter to this moment in the book of Leviticus where it says that they did this thing. And it was so bad that nobody wanted to do anything with that valley ever again. And they turned it into a dump heap. They turned it where we'll just throw our trash there. It'll just be the city dump. And, things catch on fire there and it didn't go out. So then the word Gehenna became known for judgment. Well, this is the place where that bad thing happened. We don't like this place. And then the prophets started to say, well, if you don't turn back to God, if you keep doing the things we're doing, then these foreign countries over here are going to come down and they're going to destroy the town and turn it into Gehenna. They're going to make the town, the beautiful town, look like the place that's over there that's the dump heap. And so it became known for this, the fires of judgment. And then it evolved from there and there, future and future. And we've talked about that theology in some previous stuff. But that's what it originally meant, was like a self-destruction kind of a moment. Like if you're not careful with your words, there's this destruction. Now, the god of Molech actually evolved. People still use it today. If you look up the Molech principle, we still do this, where we are sacrificing the good of our children or generations to come for short-term gains, because they were sacrificing to Molech because they needed rain, or they needed crops, or they needed blessings, so they had to pay this price on the front end. So whenever you have to do this exchange of, well, if you want all of these profits and all these gains and all these powers and all these things, well, it's going to cost you some things that are very valuable to you and important people. And we continue to do this. This is what humans do. It's called the Molech principle. You can look that up. But he says that whole principle of trying to get short-term gains at the expense of long-term health, future generations, that's what he's talking about. Not talking about where you go when you die in this moment. He's saying that desire, the self-destructive desire to get short-term gains at the expense of the people who come after you, that's what our tongues can do. That they can shape the world around us so that we're trying to get things and get more and get more and get more at the expense of the future, at the expense of the people coming after us. And so he's talking about that principle. And he says it's like this corroding force. Have you ever got rust on your car and then you didn't fix it? My Ford is that way right now. So I call it the rust bucket. And it's like you get a little bit of rust on it. If you don't fix it, it just starts corroding. And now I'm missing parts of my car. It's not even there anymore. Where there's supposed to be car, I'm looking through it and whoa. The rust does that. Looks at it it's like poison, gets in your system and it just messes you up. So he says that. Now, he says this, Howard Thurman says this, our language mirrors the world we want to create. If our words are empty of love, then our world will be void of justice. I like that. It's really good. Now, this is the translation I've come up with. Remember that it only takes a spark in our dry climate to set a whole forest on fire. Our words, which seem insignificant like a spark, are like that. They can shape a whole world of injustice, turning harmony into chaos, bringing dire consequences down upon our heads. The animals have this better understood than us. And we can tame a falcon, horse, or ox, but not our own untamed speech, which is never satisfied, consistent, or stable, and seems to tear apart and corrode our communities and the world. A little bit more understandable when we translate it to this fashion. And then he goes into this next section where he's like, people have this, well, they'll say one thing and mean another. There's a famous Batman villain that does that. He's like, he just kind of wears it right on his face there. But he's like, can you get like fresh water and bitter water out of the same spring? He's like, no, you can't do that. Here's actually a spring they didn't have like wells that had pumps that just like gave you water out of faucets and stuff. They had to go to like a spring or like a stream or a cistern and gather up water. And if that water went bad, or if the stream like went over a lot of minerals and collected a bunch of salt, that's why the Dead Sea is that way, then it's like you take a sip of that and you're like, nope, you can't drink that. And he's saying, can you get fresh water out of a mud puddle? It's not going to work. You dip it in there and it's like this corrosive force gets into like our bones and our makeup and everything. And he's saying words matter. How we use words matter. The words that we listen to and grab onto and hold onto, they matter. And Gustavo Gutierrez says this: language has the power to build or break. In every word, we either participate in the kingdom of God or contribute to the kingdom of injustice. And this last section here, it's translated this way: with our speech, we can say, praise God, and then turn around and say, go to hell, to a human being that is made in the image we just praised, which is a curse. Not just cursing for curse's sake, but we say that. We are that inconsistent, and it should not be that way. A spring is either fresh or bitter. A plant will give you either figs or grapes, depending on its nature, but not switch on you. So don't expect fresh water from a mud puddle. I was like, a little more sense. I've got a couple of reflection questions to kind of think about. First one, are the things I say silent about worth it? Because introverts, we're not let off the hook on this one just because we're quiet a little bit more than other people. The words that we say in our minds still matter as much as the ones that come out. If you're not as vocal as someone else, it doesn't mean we're just immediately off the hook from how we use our words, because the words we believe in our brains and tell ourselves in our brains without vocalizing them, they also matter. So are the things that I stay silent about worth it? Are the things I speak out about worth it? How we use our words. Do my words match God's love for people and God's hatred for injustice? And so often it's very easy to confuse those two things. And we start saying we're going to hate the people and not care about the things that are happening. And am I aware of my own inconsistencies or just other people's inconsistencies? So a reflective moment here to think about how we use our words, how we think about the people, the words that we connect to and hold on to, and what we do, because it shapes who we are. It shapes our society. It shapes our little communities. Words matter. And so recognize your words. These are the 4 different questions. Our benediction is from Psalm 116. It says this: I recognize our risen Lord and King and turn again to find my rest in him. For I have been in trouble. I will bring the anguish of my soul once more to him who feels that anguish with me. Misery and all the snares of death made faith so dim. My prayer was just a whisper, but he heard me. He raised my head and called me to look up. And now he asks one simple thing of me: to let him love me, to take the cup of my salvation and make a new communion in his love. He is the hope of all the earth, and soon he will renew the whole creation in the risen Son, whose love is steadfast and whose word is true. Psalm 116, rewritten by Malcolm.